What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about season 2 of the Lord of the Rings Rings of Power. This show once again stars people like Morfydd Clark, Charlie Vickers, Charles Edwards, Robert Aramayo, and so many more. And when the first season dropped, I did a live stream by myself just talking about the first season. It was a way of kind of catching up on talking about the show because I was a little bit behind on covering it at the time, and honestly, it was a lazy choice to go that route. I didn't want to sit down and film a normal video and edit it together. I just wanted to kind of sit down and talk about it for like 45 minutes and then, turn the live stream off and move on. But now that the second season has just come to an end yesterday as of filming this, I figured I'd sit down and do a proper review of this season. For anybody who's curious, I actually haven't covered any Lord of the Rings content here on the channel yet, but it is something I've had in my back pocket and do plan to do fairly soon. Again, as I said many times before, it's one of my favorite things about having a YouTube channel, about TV shows and movies, is that there's so much. Whether you're keeping up with new stuff, you're reviewing random niche films, you're going back and reviewing classics, there are still so many popular films and franchises that I've really yet to touch on here in this channel that are a huge part of my life. And Lord of the Rings is definitely one of those. I love the Lord of the Rings movies as a kid. I love the Hobbit films as well. Not as much as the Lord of the Rings films, but I just love that world. I've enjoyed a lot of the video games, especially some of the more recent ones like, Shadow of Mordor or Shadow of War. Those recent ones that came out, I thought those were a lot of fun to play through. I love spending time in Middle Earth. I love the lore around the Lord of the Rings content. And I'm not a big reader, so I haven't really divulged deep into Tolkien's entire lore world building. I have read the Hobbit book itself, but I haven't really read the rest of the Lord of the Rings stuff. I'm just a fan of the cinematic side of this whole world. And so when Rings of Power came out, I was pretty excited to check it out. And at the time, it was getting heavily criticized for maybe being a little bit too muddled narratively, maybe having a little bit too much going on. But one thing that it was heavily praised for was that I think it came out being the most expensive TV show ever made. And you could definitely see why. The first season was absolutely astonishing when it came down to visuals, the overall aesthetic of the show, the practical effects, the costumes, the makeup, like the overall production of the show was pretty top tier. And I'm happy to say that completely continues on here with season 2 looking just as beautiful as the first one. And in a lot of ways, I think this is some of the best looking Lord of the Rings content we've ever gotten, very much harkening back to what made the original Lord of the Rings films so awesome, the practical element to it. And because we're further with CGI technology, there are elements in the show that do look substantially better because they put the money into it. So yeah, right out of the gate, one thing that I love about Rings of Power is how beautiful it looks. And when it comes down to fantasy, one of the things you want the most is to be able to be interjected into that world and believe that world. You can dive into a sci-fi or fantasy franchise and it can be CGI heavy and you can still enjoy it, but I think some of the best things, and even something like my favorite franchise, Star Wars, is the practical stuff. I don't mind CGI, you need it for these big fantasy franchises, but when you can have something that feels practical and real, the costumes look real, the makeup makes everybody look real, especially when it comes down to things like orcs and monsters and elves, then you're gonna really buy me in immediately. And so without a doubt, Rings of Power, I just wanted to start this off by saying, once again, looks beautiful. This show was so much fun to watch on a 4K TV. I wish that this had played entirely throughout a theatrical screening, because I just think it would have been beautiful to see on a big screen. And I just wanted to praise the visuals of this show right off the top again, because I think they absolutely are nailing it when it comes down to the overall visual world building, the aesthetic, and everything that goes into the production of this show. Now, I mentioned before that this first season I covered already, and so this is going to be a review of the second season that's a little bit more spoiler free. I might do a little bit of a spoiler section at the end. I'm not entirely sure. I do unfortunately have some things to do later on today, so I don't have all day to film and edit and stuff like that. So we're going to try to get through this as quickly as I possibly can. But with that said, let's talk a little bit about how the last season ended, and then we'll get into my thoughts on this second season. At the end of the last season, we ended up learning some big revelations and the big key things that we needed going into this season. Firstly, the rings were going to start being created. Of course, the show being called The Rings of Power, I think we all expected that was going to happen a little bit more in the first season, but it's definitely felt like the first season was building up the storyline so that the rings were being created at the end, and that's a big central part of this season. Another big reveal we got at the end of the first season was that the character of Halbrand, played by Charlie Vickers, was actually Sauron, of course, the big bad of the Lord of the Rings franchise. And so we were left at the end of the first season with the fact that this guy who we thought was the good guy the entire time was actually deceiving everybody, specifically the character of Galadriel, and that he was going to be the big bad moving forward into season 2. And outside of that, there's this character that they just consistently call the Stranger, played by Daniel Wayman, who we learn at the end of that first season is possibly a very special wizard. They don't necessarily say his name, but I feel like it was pretty heavily alluded to, and if you watch this season, there's more that unravels when it comes down to that. So with all that said, going into this season, majority of it really focuses on the rings, the creation of the various rings. Of course, we know that the elves got a percentage of the rings, then there were some rings that went to the humans, and some rings that also went to the dwarves. And so this season kind of tackles the creation of all these various rings, and we get to kind of see how it starts to manipulate people, how it starts to help the elves, how it starts to help the dwarves. But the longer these wearers are wearing said rings, we got to start to see some of that manipulation of their mind and some of the greed that starts to kind of pour into who they are. And that's something that I was really curious to see about the show, with it being called the Rings of Power, because, you know, when you watch the Lord of the Rings films, there's primarily one ring that you're really honing in on, but you get to see how it completely changes characters like Bilbo Baggins or Frodo Baggins over the course of those films, and the way that other people around them start to react to these rings, specifically this one ring. And so I was really excited to kind of see more characters playing with these rings, kind of being able to see that backstory of how these rings affect people. And it was really interesting. I thought that was easily one of my favorite parts of the show, just to kind of start to see that context being built upon and seeing how it was starting to affect the various people who were, you know, getting these rings that gave them immense power, an ability to sometimes foresee the future, an ability to kind of carve a path for their people, something that seemed incredibly helpful and seemed like the right thing, and like, oh my god, we need these rings, to it eventually becoming something that is gonna eventually kind of bring down the same things that they're building up. And I thought that this season really tackled that very well. Outside of the rings, a big part of this show that is kind of entangled with the rings is Sauron. Of course, we know he specifically wants these rings created so that he can kind of use them to manipulate people. And Charles Vickers does an incredible job in this season at the character of Sauron. In the last season, he just seemed like a, you know, random kind of character. Of course, he's a big part of the show, but he seemed like just like a love interest primarily for the character of Galadriel. So learning that he was the big bad at the end of the season, I was like, okay, let's see what they end up doing. He hadn't really showcased much of him really being a bad guy in that first season. So I was curious, because he's playing Sauron, the biggest villain in the entirety of the lore of the Lord of the Rings. But going into the second season, I think he captured entirely what the character of Sauron is all about, or at least what you always hear about when you hear of him in the past. Of course, people think of him in his suit, which is badass, but here we are getting to see him in the early days deceiving and kind of being a very like Emperor Palpatine-esque character who's kind of playing both sides, using his abilities to kind of warp the minds of those around him, and using his words to make himself seem like a helpful hand when he ultimately is just deceiving and controlling the entire situation. And I think that Charlie Vickers did an incredible job in this role. I really enjoyed him as Sauron. He brought a lot of menace to the character, but he was also incredibly believable. He was a character that you can understand fully why people were deceived by him, and ultimately when he starts to show that darker side to himself, you can completely see it in his eyes, and I think he captures it incredibly well. And yeah, I thought the performance there was really solid. And then I mentioned that the big other part of the show going on here is the Stranger, learning about him over the course of the season. I was kind of disappointed with this element because we kind of already can tell who he is if you've seen the end of the last season. I feel like it's pretty obvious. And majority of the season with him and the halflings that he hangs out with, Nori and Poppy, kind of just felt like they were just lurking around, and it really wasn't until the final couple episodes that we get a little bit more answers when it comes down to his character. We also are introduced to a character that you actually see in the Hobbit films, the character of Tom Bombadil, played by Rory Kinnear in this one, which was cool to see some of those other characters from other, you know, pieces of the universe kind of connecting here. And you know, I kind of wanted more from this Stranger character. I wanted more over his exploration in the season, and unfortunately you just don't really get a lot of that until the very end of the season. I thought it was a cool part of the show, but just not something that was ever explored enough. Outside of that, I would say my favorite part of this season was everything that had to do with Galadriel. She finds herself kind of in the mix with a lot of things when it comes down to the elves and different kind of, issues that the elves are dealing with. Of course, the rise of Sauron. She's trying to warn everybody about the fact that Halbrand was actually Sauron. And of course, this all leads to her eventually coming face to face with Sauron, which I do think leads to some really great emotional beats in the latter half of the season. And I thought that the actress Morfydd Clark, who plays Galadriel, does an incredible job over the course of the show. She has some of the best action sequences as well. And anytime Galadriel was a part of a sequence, it was probably some of my favorite stuff in the show. On top of her, in terms of elves, you also have the character of Elrond, played by Robert Aramayo, who I enjoyed in the first season, but I think has way more to do in this season. And I thought he was really, really compelling as the character of Elrond. It's tough when you have all these actors playing characters that are already played by top tier actors in things like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And I think that these actors who are playing them here in these prequel series have done a really great job of establishing themselves as these characters without it feeling like they feel disjointed and disconnected from the other things that we've seen them in. And I think that they've done a good job of making this iteration of the character worthwhile. It's one of those things where it can be a tough balance, right? You can have some actors come in to play a long-lasting character who's already been portrayed by a big actor, only for them to come in and kind of give a lackluster performance. And I think in the case of this show, the casting all around for these legacy characters, these younger versions of them, have been really solid, and I've really appreciated what they brought to the role and how they've added to the overall mythology and context of these characters. Now, a character that I enjoyed in the first season, who at the end of the first season was central to creating the rings and is a central part, the main part to creating the rings in the second season, who I enjoyed a lot more here, was the character of Lord Celebrimbor, who was played by Charles Edwards. And I enjoyed him in the first season, as I mentioned. He's a charming elf character. He has that leadership role, very elegant. And I feel like this second season gave him a lot more to do. There are a lot of incredible sequences between the character of Celebrimbor and Sauron that I thought really, really worked throughout the course of the show, which were some of the most dramatic. And a lot of it takes place in a similar location because most of it is around building the rings. He's kind of being forced to build the rings throughout the course and being deceived to build the rings over the course of the season, with Sauron kind of over his shoulder. And I thought that was all handled really well. I thought that the actor Charles Edwards did an incredible job of conveying the various emotions that were needed here and playing this elegant, leader character who finds himself broken at times, but also has this will within himself to fight back against Sauron. I thought that element of the show was captured really, really well, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. And then the last thing I really want to talk about here that I really enjoyed was the dwarf side of the storyline, because we get to see what happens with them when the king ends up getting his hands on one of the rings. Of course, this, like I mentioned before, helps the elves for a percentage of time, ultimately for it to eventually kind of start to unravel things. Greed starts to kind of seep into the mind of the king, and the dwarves find themselves in a situation where things are not necessarily as good as it seemed like things were going to be. And a big central part of this whole storyline is the prince of this, Prince Durin, played by Owain Arthur, as well as his wife, Princess Disa, played by Sophie Nomvit. And I thought that the two of them gave great performances here, very much invoking the dwarf vibe, not only in their accent, but you very much feel like all of these actors capture the sense of fantasy here, where you completely believe that they are these elves, that they are these dwarves, that they are these orcs and stuff like that. We're going to talk about the orcs too. I actually kind of forgot that I have to mention them as well. But yeah, I really enjoyed the storyline here that had to do with the dwarves. I think that Prince Durin had a lot more to do in this season, which was something that I had a little bit of a gripe with the first season, where he was present, but it felt like in this season they really paid off a lot of the buildup that was happening in that first season. And I feel like Prince Durin really had a character arc over the course of the season, and the Dwarven storyline leads to a big, cool cameo action sequence at the very end of the final episode that I think is either going to make some people feel like it was like a forced Easter egg, or make some other fans think, oh, that's pretty badass. I found myself on the latter of thinking that was pretty badass. Now, there are other storylines that are going on in the show, and that's one of the things that was a big gripe that people had of the first season, was that there were so many storylines, so many characters, that it was kind of hard to follow, and not all of them really paid off. And I feel similarly when it comes down to this season. I think that there's way too many characters, and I think we're at a point now, hopefully moving into season 3, where we should start killing off some of these characters, because it's not that I don't want to see these characters die, but I do think that the show has a few storylines that are really integral, that get majority of the screen time, that get majority of the development, and then there are these just other random characters in the mix in all of these departments, whether it be the dwarf characters, whether it be the elves, whether it be the humans, that I don't think really get the the abundance of storytelling. And I think the weakest side of this entire show and this entire season was the human storyline. We get to see a bit of a power struggle going on there for leadership in their world, and everything that was going on with the humans. Every time we got to their part of the story, they felt the most disjointed from what was going on with the rings, what was going on with the elves, what was going on with the orcs, and what was going on with the dwarves. They felt the most disjointed, like they had their own drama happening in a separate corner of what's going on. And I'm sure a lot of that is to set up what's to come. I'm sure that will all kind of coalesce a little bit more in the next season. But watching it, there was this element that felt like I just never really found myself overly compelled by the human storyline. And because there's so many small characters that are within that human storyline that don't really get an abundance to do, there are a couple that are, focused on a little bit more and given more story, but I never found that they were all really given an abundance. There's not a grand sense of character arcs across the human characters, and there are a lot of them that are just kind of present. And you find that in all the other storylines as well. There are elves like the character of Arondir, played by Ismael Cruz Cordova, who I think is a cool looking actor. I think he looks the part. He has some great action sequences in both the first season and this one, but I don't think that the show has done much to really give him much to do. And so when you look at the human characters, I feel like there's a lot more of that. Just a bunch of characters that, again, there is a story playing out. It's easy to follow. You know what's going on. But every time it cut to them, it just felt like that storyline was not nearly as important as what was going on with the rest of the storylines in the show. And I'm hoping in season 3 they can kind of expand upon that a little bit more. And then the last storyline to mention here are the Orcs, the orcs in this season. And one thing that's really interesting is that the actor Joseph Mall, who played Adar in the first season, actually didn't return this time around, instead of being played by Sam Hazeldine, who plays the new version of Adar. And I think that they did a great job when it comes down to makeup and just jumping into the season where you almost don't even realize it. I remember seeing the announcement that the actor who played him in the first season was not going to be returning, and so going into this season and having this new actor play him, the makeup and just his performance in general did an incredible job of just getting me right back into the action and not really having me feel distracted that it's a new actor. Of course, if you really think about it and if you look at images of the two, and I'm sure binge watching this show in the future it'll be a little bit more noticeable, but for people who had a gap from the first season to the second season and just kind of watch them separately, I think it's easy to kind of jump into this next season with the makeup and with his performance feeling very consistent with what the first Adar did, where it feels consistent. The recasting doesn't really feel jarring, and I really enjoyed that. And I thought that the actor who played Adar in this season brought a lot to the performance, and I enjoyed a lot that was going on with the Orcs and the Orcs in general. I thought that was a really cool part of the story. I do wish they had done a little bit more with them, but ultimately I feel like they were kind of setting them up to kind of get us to where we are at the end of this season, where it feels like we're finally at a place at the end of this season where a lot of the elements in terms of lore that we're familiar with when it comes down to the Lord of the Rings is kind of all set together now for the third season, I think, to be like a big culmination of a lot of these storylines with the rings, with Sauron, the orcs, with the dwarves, and all these different things. It feels like they're kind of finally coalescing in a way where the next season is going to be really great. And so I don't want it to sound like this is all like setup or anything like that. I think the first season, looking back on it, was a lot of story but a lot of setup for this season, and I think that this season had a lot of meat and potatoes to really build upon all the context and story that we want to see, so that the third season can be a lot more payoff for a lot of these storylines. And that's where I'm hoping we'll start to see some of the human characters have more to do. That's where I'm hoping that we'll see some of the other side characters have a bigger role in the story. But ultimately, I think the stakes are high moving into the next season, and I'm really excited to see what they do. Now, one thing to also say though in terms of the stakes is that there are times throughout the course of the show where characters like Galadriel or Elrond or other characters who do appear in other storylines like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are in danger, and it's hard to really feel a sense of danger for them, knowing that these characters are going to be okay and will appear in later storylines. But that's not to take away from the action in those moments and the tension of those moments. It's just something I thought that was worth mentioning. With all that said though, I think that this second season of The Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, is definitely worth watching. I think the special effects, again, the overall production of the show is absolutely stunning. The cinematography, all of that, the overall makeup work, everything about this, the way that the show looks and feels is top tier. The musical score, the overall overall sound design of the show I think is great, and the performances are great. All the actors are really committed to this high fantasy storytelling, this dialogue that comes out incredibly Shakespearean in a lot of ways, that really works. And at times the episodes can be a little bit slow, but I think that one thing that you can commend this show for is that they jam-pack a lot of story into these individual episodes, to the point where you get to the end of the show and you feel like you've really experienced a lot of various storylines. I think the one thing that this show could really do moving into season 3 though is cutting back on some of those storylines, or bringing some of these storylines together so that you have less to kind of jump around to, and we can instead focus on a lot of these characters, but in more integral stories with some of the bigger pieces of the puzzle. I think there's just absolutely things that they are focusing on stronger when it comes down to story, and completely negating other things that they'll spend time on, but it never really feels like it amounts to an abundance. So we'll see what they end up doing with season 3, and nevertheless, I'm really excited to see season 3, so I hope they continue on with the next season of Ring of Powers. I'm really enjoying this show so far, and in the coming months, I think I'm going to make it a point to do a rewatch of all the Hobbit films and Lord of the Rings films, and do a revisiting series here on the channel. I look forward to covering those movies here on the channel, finally, and big thanks to you guys for watching, and let me know your thoughts down below. Are you a big fan of this season? Did you like what they did? Did you not like what they did? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.